So hello, and ready for another Consciousness Cafe, a little bit different this time. It's going to be with Malcolm Parlett, as you know, and some of it will be interactive. So he's not only going to tell you about whole intelligence, but also give you some sort of living sense of what it might be like to interact from that kind of space. I've known Malcolm for quite a while. He's a very senior figure in the Gestalt movement worldwide, and these days trains Gestalt therapists. He's also a bit of a radical within the movement. And his book on whole intelligence is actually an expression of that radical change that he's interested in introducing. And that's recently been reissued, and so he's keen to make you acquainted with it. In the break, there will be copies of that book available for purchase if of interest. So, as we're starting slightly late, I won't say anything more, but just welcome Malcolm Parlett to talk about this new subject.
The reality is that we live in a highly complex world. And just a quote from myself. What I wrote was, in the blurb that got you here, so there was obviously something in it, it's time for a grown-up conversation about humanity's chances of avoiding becoming either extinct or becoming subservient to technical overlordship. As a global population, can human beings up their game, flourish, and continue to evolve? That's the question that I'm asking. And I go on to say that being an intelligent species, what's the good of that if we don't act intelligently as a species? And I think it's fairly obvious, if we look around the world, that the results of our activities are mixed. Some things are indeed highly intelligent, seeming. They're changing things for the better. More and more people are involved and so on. And other things that we're doing seem to be plunging us back into more primitive, destructive patterns. So there are areas, I would say, of complete absence of whole intelligence in so many areas of public life. Can we do things differently, take a radical step forward to operating on a different plane altogether? Can we make a jump, in a sense, in terms of our consciousness? Now, I'm feeling a little hot, so if I take off my jacket, that's going to cause all sorts of problems, isn't it? Oh, no. Thank you. What I'm getting into here is another aspect of whole intelligence, which is paying attention to my body's truth, my actual state of being in the moment, and then experimenting with finding something, and I feel better now. I responded to the situation. So already I'm beginning to introduce the different abilities, the different dimensions of whole intelligence. And Warren, could you pass these out? It's a little diagram with a few words. While you're doing that, let me just say that part of what we're doing is an adventure in phronesis. Phronesis was a Greek word taken over by the Romans, and it's practical wisdom, the wisdom in determining ends and the means of attaining them. It's promoting the vision that our implicit wisdom, our capacity as human beings to do things, is often taken for granted, or it's in the background, and we're going to bring it into the foreground this evening to talk about 5 aspects of this, of what Aristotle described as phronesis, which is one form of knowing. He also talked about episteme, which is scientific knowledge, and techne, which is the kind of knowing that we bring to doing practical things, like we know how to throw a pot or... Well, we've also, I want to acknowledge the sort of, the wonderfully complex facets of this evening, technologically, because there also are something like a dozen, 15, 20 people online who are hearing this. What happened? Okay. Well, so those are the, you've got a diagram in front of you, hopefully, that captures the essential model, the 5 dimensions of whole intelligence that I have been researching for over, I don't know, 25 years or more. And I've come from a background of being, right from my birth on, really, as soon as I became conscious of my surroundings, I've been an observer and looking into who people are and what their relationship to me is and so on. So I became a kind of an observer of humanity, of human beings. I became absorbed in it. So I was a bit like a natural historian. Some people get fascinated by looking at snails or something, and they become specialists in snails and everything to do with them. And I was rather like that with how people related together and how they formed groups and applied pressure and so on. So this, and then I went to, I started as an experimental psychologist and realized that what experimental psychologists do in labs is often very divorced from, quotes, real life, unquotes. Deliberately so. It's a reductive process. And I realized that I was not a reductionist. I was a holist. I always wanted to see the bigger picture. I wanted to see how things worked, how people related together, what they were doing, and so on. And out of that came a period of my life which actually lasted about 10 years, where I was studying students and teachers and the relationship between them and the social structures and the institutions and the expectations of people in educational settings. And then I discovered Gestalt therapy, which was a life-changing experience for me, massively life-changing, because I had operated entirely in a sort of academic, intellectual frame, and I suddenly realized that in terms of, I didn't know the words, but in terms of phronesis, I was completely a beginner. I was completely a beginner in terms of understanding and appreciating the subtleties and complexities of human beings in actual life. And it was a devastating experience for me when I started, and then I became hooked, and I've been involved in the Gestalt movement ever since. But part of the problem that I've had is that Gestalt has moved very much in a direction of being more like every other kind of psychotherapy, modeling, in a sense, something which is quite confined and specialized, often in very, very useful ways for people, but not taking one of the features of Gestalt, which was the fact that we are social animals and not just biologically and psychologically separate beings. We are parts of communities, parts of groups, parts of societies, and we are subject to a vast range of influences and pressures that exist in the environment. And I wanted to somehow acknowledge that and to find ways to take the ideas of Gestalt and the practices of Gestalt into a much wider frame altogether, which has accounted for my addiction, if you like, my very special interest in whole intelligence. What happened was that I woke up one day. I'd been thinking a lot about how did the people who were studying Gestalt change. I was training them and so on. What was happening to them developmentally? How did they, in a sense, begin to take on the ideas and apply them in their lives? And what I found, I went to bed thinking about this, and in the morning I had the answer. And the answer was these 5 things that you see in the diagram. Those were the words, actually, that came to me. I started testing them and questioning and teaching them and thinking about them and so on. And they have become the sort of framework, the fundamental framework for the activities that we are practicing. What I'm going to do as the sort of format for this evening is to take you through each of them in turn. But I think the first thing I want to do is to do a little practical thing, which people online may or may not be able to do. It doesn't involve anything, but I'm going to take 2 or 3 minutes for you to make contact with someone else or more than one person here who you don't know but you'd like to meet. Just in any way you want to do that. So get up, move around, and find somebody that you don't know, and get to know them a little bit. One more minute. So we're going to come back now. Can you draw it to a close? Yeah. Okay. You're going to get used to me interrupting you when you're just in the middle of an interesting encounter. I apologize for that, but it's a necessary part of presenting the different ideas. The first dimension that we're talking about, and you've just been practicing, is interrelating. It's connecting, making connections, building a little, if you like, bubble around you and the other person or persons that you're speaking to. And this is something which we take for granted, but actually it needs to be part of any act of operating an intelligent society, is that there are these opportunities to be heard, to speak, to be received, and this is what you were doing. Now, we could we could spend the whole evening on that, because and sometimes we're doing longer sessions. I would spend quite a lot of time. But alongside trainings in mediation, diversity awareness, conflict resolution, community building, bereavement counseling, and recognizing and handling trauma, these are some of the specialist fields which exist and which are having a cumulatively big effect on our society and our way of doing things, particularly in places like Tonnes. So it's like these 5 dimensions are not foreign imports. They're not something that I've just dreamed up and are imposing on a model. They are things that are actually happening, and changes which are happening, and hopeful changes. So I think in some ways the whole intelligence is growing naturally as society becomes more conscious. However, in order for the whole world to change, we've got to, in a sense, place as being important the fact that people need relationships and they need support for maintaining relationships and for building on the connection, the connectivity that actually we are all wanting. Not all the time. There has to be a balance between being alone and being with others. But you could see, and very clear here tonight, that as soon as people have a chance to connect, they get on with it. You get on with it. We all want connection. So it's part of our humanity. And the real task for the whole intelligence movement and our practices is to see what we can import from Gestalt tradition into the everyday skillfulness of human beings, acknowledging their skillfulness. Like, everybody needs to connect, but there are all sorts of ways in which we interrupt connection. There's some, if you like, I'll give you an example. That some people, if you talk to them, you really feel heard. You feel understood. What you say has landed in their experience, and they've indicated by not necessarily words, but through the whole way that they are, that they've got it, that they've heard you. There's been a contactful exchange. Other encounters that you have, you may talk, but somebody's sort of half attending to something else, or they interrupt with questions or bring in their own process. Oh, that happened to me, or that's just what my mother used to say, or all sorts of ways in which it doesn't actually happen. The skillfulness of wanting to connect also needs practice. It needs to be helped along. And there are many interruptions to flow, to the unfolding of things that can happen when we connect. And we all know that if there were fewer misunderstandings, clearer agreements about boundaries, increased respect for the distinctive qualities of each person, and greater empathy, that a lot of unnecessary suffering in the world would be eliminated or certainly improved. The functioning of committees could change a lot. If the committee, if people didn't jump on each other and try and finish their sentences or bring in their own distraction, but actually listened, actually heard, and responded to what they heard. So this is an example of only one dimension, and all 5 dimensions have a role. That's absolutely essential to realize that this isn't a one thing. Whole intelligence is a collection of different kinds of engagement with the world and with each other. And this one is absolutely important and a cardinal one. But so is the next one. So I'm again going to ask you to do something which you can stay in your seat for this one, but I'd like you, and it's quite provocative, I'd like you to tune in to your felt sense. In other words, to your body, to your feeling state, your energetic balance, so that you become, if you like an animal rather than a human being with lots of words and lots of concepts. And the question I'm going to ask you, which is quite provocative, particularly at the moment, I'm going to say something, and then I'd like you to just tune in to the bodily impact of considering how have you been affected in your body and are at this moment by the American election and the beginning of President Trump's era. And if you notice something, a feeling, or an emotion, or a posture, or something that you want to do with your body, you might want to do it right now, but more to the point, I just really want you to notice. Because we live in a culture which prioritizes intellect-based intelligence. It's become the taken for granted norm of what we mean by intelligence. And it's the basis of our education. And yet, human beings' overall ability to navigate a mature selfhood and functional well-being through life relies as much on what is gathered from non-verbal sources that we have as those that are verbal or numerical. In other words, what you experience in your body, in your feeling state, is data. And it's data which is incredibly important information about the world and about how you are being impacted and involved in the world. And we know that little educational attention, if any at all, is given to the kinds of knowing that come from direct sensing. Seeing, hearing, touching, tasting, smelling, and experiencing multiple variations of what we call feeling. There's a little bit I've written here in which I'm rather proud of. I don't often feel very proud of my writing, but this time I did. With every move to a faster, more virtual, automated, physically safer and more sanitized world, there is further separation from direct touching, smelling, handling, lifting, stretching, and physically moving across distances. For the majority of human beings, certainly in industrialized societies, our physical surroundings have become denatured and unstimulating. On a previous draft, I talked about our capacity for going to Australia sitting down. It's a mark of the fact that we've created a world, a human world, in which we are asked to become, rewarded for becoming desensitized. And yet, becoming, if we think about the environmental crisis, the destruction of our beautiful planet and the biosphere, becoming more embodied, in other words, more in touch with our feelings, states, and our sensations, and our internal feelings, becoming more embodied is vitally necessary in awakening the public to the world crisis. And the example I've got here is the felling of trees to build a road can be looked at in a whole number of different ways, as being economically functional, as a challenge to sustainability, or as yet another human assault on the resilience of the biosphere. But it's also a moment when we ought to be, in a sense, grieving. And that's happening more and more, that people are grieving over the loss and the destruction of trees and of many, many, many other developments. And in a sense, if we're going to have a different world, if we're going to make any impact on living more intelligently, we have to cultivate the qualities, our capacities for becoming more embodied, more in touch with ourselves. And there are people, of course, who spend tons of time in gyms or may do stretching and yoga positions, and I don't want to diminish the value of these things, but they don't necessarily connect to this kind of connecting with the world and connecting with ourselves in relationship to the things around us. So embodying becomes another feature of our need to be sensitized and aware of what's happening around us and in us. So I think maybe, let's see how much time we're doing. I'm going to go straight on to the next, or the third dimension, which I'm going to talk about, which we call self-recognizing. And because in a way, these all fit together. They're not sort of separate. It's not a 5-category model. It's much more like the usual image I give is that if you imagine a smallish Spanish town with, I'm thinking of Avila, where there's 5 gateways to the town. It's a walled town. And you go into the center of it, and you realize that the center of the town is where everything's happening. And that the fact you've come in a particular way is irrelevant. And after a while, getting to know the town, you can come from one gateway or to another gateway. At the beginning, it's important to decide which gateway you're going to go into, but after a while, it becomes irrelevant. So in a sense, these dimensions are on the way to developing an overall appreciation of yourself, ourselves, and the reality that we're engaged in all the time. But they are different, and it's quite important to maintain the different gateways at the beginning. If you want to go to this part of the town, go here, or so on. So the self-recognizing is like it joins up with what you've just been doing in tuning into your bodily sensations. So, and what sense do you make of what you discovered? Once you get into making sense of what you noticed, what you felt, you're moving into a place of what I'm calling self-recognizing, which is awareness, mindfulness, becoming aware of the reality of what you experienced, and giving it some shape, beginning some form, to help investigate what it's like for you to be a person alive now who is being, almost certainly to some extent, influenced by politics a long way away, but is also very close. And we've got our own versions of Trump, as we know. But notice, what does it trigger from you in your past? And what does it tell you about your patterns of avoidance or patterns of ensuring you have a sense of what's going on in the world? Some people are completely addicted to the news. Other people won't look at the news at the moment at all, under any circumstances. These are patterns that can fill different people with different emotions. They can bring out courage, but they can also bring out a sense of insignificance or powerlessness. But notice what is evoked for you and what you've made sense of. So I'm going to now suggest that you find somebody, maybe the same person you were with before or somebody else that you'd like to spend a bit of time with. But let's take about 7 or 8 minutes, and we'll call time, just to, in a sense, share what you've noticed, to bring more attention to yourself in relationship to the bigger picture. So over to you, and the people online, I think you're going to have also an opportunity to do something. Okay, can we be drawing this to a close? So self-recognizing, which belongs very much in the tradition of know thyself, knowing what one is doing, how it is being done, and what the point is of continuing to do it, makes obvious sense. Awareness and mindfulness and discovery about ourselves is something which clearly goes with acting more intelligently, particularly if we notice the ways in which we still trip ourselves up, even when we think we're doing something different. So, of course, it runs into resistance as an activity. This is one which is bitterly opposed in lots of business settings. Inquiries such as stopping and asking what are we doing and why are we doing it and do we want to carry on doing this can be dismissed. They're seen as time wasting, navel gazing, or picking over the past unnecessarily. And yet there are other sterling examples of, and I'm thinking particularly of the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission, where self-recognizing became, in a sense, not just an individual inquiry process, but a whole process of joint inquiry into the way things are, and discovering how to perhaps learn for the future. So I'm moving on because of time to the fourth dimension, which is experimenting, and which we mentioned right at the very beginning. Because the more aware that we become, the more we need we realize the challenges of dealing with change and the perpetual uncertainties of living today. And it's very easy for many people to lean into predictable patterns and slavish adherence to established institutions and habits and standard procedures. They become a lifeline. So there's nothing wrong with that. It's nothing about heavy judgment on this, and we do need the frameworks to keep within agreed moral limits and respecting others' needs for security and reliability. They're essential accompaniments. And we also need a capacity to go beyond what is familiar, usual, habitual, taken for granted, done automatically, just as if we don't almost have to engage ourselves because we're just doing what we always do and expect other people to do what they've done. There are many, many ways in which we do need consistency for purposes of safety and security and protection of others and ourselves. We are habitual creatures. That's the way we are organized. At the same time, we also always have the possibility of doing something differently, of moving up to what I call the familiarity boundary and looking at the possibility of doing something different now, something that's not our usual pattern. And this reaching out beyond the familiarity boundary obviously is open to abuse, it's open to breaking of moral standards, say, or whatever. So it's not something to say, oh, it's a good thing to always go for novelty. But on the other hand, it's also necessary, particularly in a highly habituated, patterned world where people do operate largely on automatic for long periods of times, to stop and with self-recognizing, to recognize, here's a chance we could do something different. Here's something that we could try out. We've never done it before. And the nature of crossing the familiarity boundary into the realm of the strange, the unusual, the uncertain, the different from safe, it's an element of risk. And we can, too many people, too often, avoid crossing that boundary because they feel frightened, particularly being shamed if they start doing something which is contrary to what is generally accepted as the norm. And in the process, they deprive themselves of some of that natural creativity and artistry of life that, in a sense, fuels our energy, brings our energy, brings us into a heightened sense of contact with reality. So it's a balance. And there's always a balance between the need to stay the same and do things that are regular and methodical and safe and connected and very supportive, particularly for people at certain times. Like, we know how dangerous it is for very elderly people to move physically into a different environment. So we need to hold that. At the same time, we also need the enlivening function of doing something for the first time, taking that risk, going a different way home, or whatever it is. So, and then the last one, so I'm just moving straight on to the last one, is what we call responding to the situation. And the situation is, our lives are full of challenges, things happening, events, interactions which affect us, may trigger some old memories. And again, we can be habituated, we may be stuck in patterns where we keep on doing the same kind of things. So there's some people, I count myself as one of them, who is a bit of a junkie for novelty and excitement and doing things for the first time. And I've had to learn that actually in doing things the same way isn't such a bad thing. It's necessary, and I need to do more of it. So it's like we all have these patterns, particularly about how we adjust to the situations we encounter. But the thing is that every organism, from slime mold to trees, from bacteria to primate animals, is to some extent adaptive and fluidly capable, adjusting to varied conditions. So what are the conditions of our lives and the conditions of our world that we want to adjust to and accept, and which do we want to reject or change or investigate? And it brings us into experimenting, the need for experimenting, and the need to recognize how we are affected and what we're doing. And what we're going to do is very shortly to have a break, and it's a good opportunity for you to consider how you have responded to what's happened tonight in this situation of coming to the Consciousness Cafe, meeting one or two people that you may have not met before, how you've dealt with the things that have been triggered in you, the memories, the features of your life that are being played out here, the common features, and to give attention to that. So I think that during the break, and I think Max is going to say something about the break, but I would ask you to look over, in a sense, the 5 dimensions, see how you connect to them, and which ones seem very easy and you know about them, but which ones offer a bit of a challenge or something that to learn from, and to think aloud with me and others involved about where do we go with advancing whole intelligence? How do we bring this more into the public view? Because in a sense, these are 5 very ordinary aspects of human beings, but they've often been ignored and they're certainly not taught in schools. And what can we do about that? Is it worth doing? So you might want to think about that during the break as well. So I'll stop there and hand over to Max.
Thank you to Malcolm for the first half. And the second half will be all question and answers and engagements with Malcolm.